Hello and welcome to another JDP featured faculty. Today we have Dr. Deepa Sundaram of the University of Denver Religious Studies Department. She is the Assistant Professor of Hindu Studies, Critical Theory, and Digital Religion. So I appreciate you being here today with me and for talking a little bit about what you do and your role here in the JDP. So just to start us off, do you want to expand more on your scholarship and areas of academic interest?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, David. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be teaching with the JDP. So a lot of my research looks at digital spaces. I'm interested in the formation of micro and macro publics. I'm interested in the formation of religious and religious nationalist communities. And I also look at online hate politics and the production of ritual within online spaces. That is the bulk of my work. But my training is actually classical. So I'm a classically trained Sanskritist as well as a Tamilist, and my dissertation work looked at anti-colonial Tamil drama from 1900 to
Wow.
1930. And I am somebody who was really interested in the theory of performance and ritual.
Wow, that's really cool. Do you want to share a little bit more about how are you engaging with some of this in the online spaces? Um,
Sure. Yeah. So in 2016, I started doing some research for a class on online yoga practices, and I sort of discovered this entire world, and I started, digging into it, and that's how I got into researching online spaces. And as I started looking more at this, one of the things that came out to me is the kinds of communities and associations and meaning making mechanisms that were being formed online were similar but different to the same kinds of associations we see in analog spaces. And what really fascinated me in particular was the ways in which people formed associations and how that shaped their own identity politics, as well as how that shaped their entry into various kinds of socialities,
mm,
various societies, various
mhm.
political movements, various resistance movements, and in some cases, as has become more the case, right? Various extremist movements.
Yeah.
That's really what I do is really looking at these communities. And most of my research for that reason is on social platforms, social networking platforms that have spaces for people to gather. So while many folks that do the kind of work that I do spend a lot of time in places like X, formerly known as Twitter, most of my research looks at Instagram and Facebook, in particular, Facebook groups and pages, because again, I'm interested in those sort of homophilies, as we call them, right? Like people who find like-minded individuals who find community within these online networked and in some ways, interestingly, siloed spaces.
Yeah, that's really fascinating stuff, especially as we think about how the world is functioning right now. And that kind of makes me think too about like just the interdisciplinary nature of that kind of research when looking at these kind of communities. So do you want to talk a little bit about like what multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary means in the context of your work and how that applies to the JDP as a whole?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think one of the beauties of religious studies, like one of the most amazing things about this as what I would call, a field, not so much just a discipline. And the reason I say that is I think that for me, that difference is that we are interdisciplinary,
Mm,
but we are a field. And so that means you have historians, anthropologists, media scholars, literary scholars, historians, right? All those different groups that come together under the sort of umbrella of religious studies. And I think at its core, the study of religion requires that kind of interdisciplinarity to be effective. Having said that, for my own work, I'm a semiotician. So I look at meaning making mechanisms. That's what my dissertation and my first monograph will be looking at, as well as my current work in the digital space. I'm really
mm,
interested in how people are making meaning and what kinds of affordances that we have through online platforms for that kind of meaning making that is already, we know, right? We have a lot of work on, I should say, how that works in analog spaces. And for
right.
me, I consider myself as someone who sits at that intersection of literary studies, critical theory, religious studies, and political science, since a lot of my work also thinks about how this kind of meaning making works for particular kinds of political publics, as well as things like extremist publics, resistant publics, and various kinds of constituencies. So I'm interested in sort of how people are forming those associations, both at the macro level and thinking about broad and diverse socialities, as well as on the micro level of small communities, that are forming in particular Facebook groups, something like one
Yeah.
platform, one group, and then thinking about how those sort of, micro bounded spaces are also networked. So
Right.
that requires me to really bring in, ideas and theories and methodologies from a lot of different spaces. And one last thing I'll say about that is that has also led me to becoming less of a qualitative scholar. I should say less of a purely qualitative scholar to becoming more of a mixed method scholar, somebody who chooses to sort of bring in that quant research to really expand the scope of the kind of work that I do.
Yeah, that's awesome. And also sounds a lot broader than what maybe a lot of people think about when they imagine what religious studies can be and what you can then do with religious studies.
That's
So,
true.
do you have any thoughts on like what maybe the biggest misconception or myth related to the field of religious studies is?
Sure. I mean, I think that that's a great question. Like, I think that one of the biggest problems that we have right now is this sort of, you know, misconceptions in general about the humanities study and what value it brings to our society as a whole, but also to the workplace as a whole. And I think that religious studies has suffered from this idea that people who study religion are necessarily interested in practicing a particular religion, or are interested in advancing the goals of a particular religion or agenda of a particular religion, and it's really seen or associated with theology. And I think that is the biggest misconception that I see, right? Is that the academic study of religion is about the academic study of how people make sense of the world. That is something to me that is at its core one of the most important things we do as human beings as we navigate our lives, right? And we continue to do that. And that particular misconception is replicated in media outlets. And so for me, as a professor, but also as a public intellectual, I believe that training my students not only for careers within the academy so they can correct these kinds of misconceptions within the broader academic space, but also training my students to be able to speak intelligently with evidence-based arguments in public venues, right? So making sure that they're able to communicate these ideas, out of our program in newspapers, media outlets, podcasts, blogs, as well as other kinds of venues in which they get the opportunity to share this very important literacy that is
Mhm.
largely lacking, right, in our public square, particularly, I would say, by legacy media. So this is a really important aspect, I think, of our program, in where we are providing an intervention in a space where there is a dearth of good understanding of a topic that is actually remarkably timely and remarkably impactful on how we understand ourselves in this world and in relationship to others, right? A lot of our polarization, a lot of the extremism we talk about, that we hear the media talk about, that you hear from regular people, right? A lot of that, I think, is rooted in a lack of literacy about understanding what religion means. And I'm going to throw a shameless plug and shout out to my good friend Megan Goodwin and Elise Morgenstein first, and their new book coming out with Beacon Books, called Religion Isn't Done With You Yet, based on their podcast, Keeping It 101. Because this is the core, right? Religion may not be done with you, even if you think you're done with it. And that is why every single person in the world needs to have religious literacy. And that is what makes the JDP such a unique program, because we are interdisciplinary. We are a program that trains students for both academic and public facing and other types of work. And we are focused specifically on the impact of religion on society, politics, and culture.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great answer. I think that really, I think, speaks a lot to where we are in society and as culture is moving. I mean, I even think about that for my own research. Like, you know, religion is important for all the communities I study, even if it doesn't initially feel like that. Um, but to wrap us up here, do you just want to share a little bit about the hobbies and the things that you enjoy doing outside of academia?
Sure. Yeah. I long to go back to those hobbies one day.
No, yeah.
Most of my time is taken up by a job I love very much. And in particular, it's the students of not only the joint doctoral program, but also at DU that are an inspiration for me and why I do this work. And so I should say that first. And that's why I don't mind spending most of my time with them. But outside of DU, one of the things that I enjoy personally is doing a lot of hiking and canyoning. Not this summer, but typically in the summers, my spouse and I head out to the canyons in southern Utah and usually try to get ourselves, just away from everything and spend some time out there. And so that's one of my favorite things to do. And the other things I like to do is spend time with my pets. I love animals. As a colleague of mine once said, always with dogs, and that's kind of my motto as well. And so I've got two dogs, Luna and Sadie, um, and I've got a cat, and I spend a lot of time with her. And I love being out with them, walking them, and just being outside as much as possible. And I would say that the other hobby I'd really like to get back to is playing tennis, but being an assistant professor takes up a lot of your time. But one of my long-term goals as I continue to, become a part of the fabric here of DU is to get back to my roots and get hitting the tennis ball around.
That's awesome. And I appreciate you really being here today. So this was, again, Dr. Deepa Sundaram of the University at Denver. And again, she is Assistant Professor of Hindu Studies, Critical Theory, and Digital Religion. And this was the University of Denver and Isla School of Theology's joint doctoral program in the study of religions featured faculty. So thanks again for your time, Dr. Sundaram.
Thanks so much for having me, David. It was a real pleasure.